Reddit, what other shocking stuff happened in 2001? The dot-com bubble burst in 2001, and that was a huge deal for the tech world. A lot of companies that were riding high in the late 90s went bankrupt almost overnight. Tons of people lost their jobs, and it was one of the biggest market crashes in recent history. But 9/11's pretty much overshadowed everything that year, and this huge financial collapse got pushed into the background. Another massive thing in 2001 that got overlooked was the rise of China into the World Trade Organization, WTO. It fundamentally shifted global trade and set China up to become the manufacturing powerhouse we know today. It's crazy because this one decision ended up affecting jobs, economies, and global politics for decades to come, but it was barely on anyone's radar at the time because of the attacks and the war on terror. The collapse of Enron is something that normally would have dominated headlines for months. This was a massive corporation, and when it came out that they were committing one of the biggest frauds in American history, it shocked the business world. Thousands of employees lost their pensions, and the ripple effect it had on financial regulations was significant. Because this happened at the end of 2001, it barely got the coverage you'd expect. Without 9/11s, I think the Enron scandal would have been the story of that year. The anthrax attacks are another event that got buried under the headlines. Right after the Twin Towers fell, a series of letters containing anthrax spores were mailed to various ballot outlets and U.S. senators. People were already on edge from the terror attacks, and this just added to the fear. Several people died, and it took years to figure out who was behind it, but it definitely didn't get the attention it would have otherwise. 2001 also saw the release of the Human Genome Project's first draft. This was a groundbreaking achievement in science. Mapping the entire human genome was like opening the door to a new era in medicine and genetics. The implications of this are still being felt today in everything from cancer research to genetic testing, but because of 9/11s, it didn't get nearly the attention it deserved. There was also the collapse of Argentina's economy. In December 2001, Argentina defaulted on its debt, and the country plunged into chaos. There were massive protests, and the president had to flee by helicopter. It was a major event in South America, and the effects are still felt in Argentina today. But again, with the world's attention focused on the US after 9/11s, this story didn't make much of a splash globally. In the world of entertainment, 2001 was the year the first Harry Potter movie came out, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. It was the start of what would become one of the biggest film franchises of all time. Under normal circumstances, this would have been a bigger deal, but with everything happening in the world, it felt like it got lost in the mix a little bit. The NATO Article 5 invocation is another thing that's often overlooked. After 9/11s, NATO invoked Article 5 for the first and only time in its history, meaning an attack on one member was considered an attack on all. This was huge in terms of international relations, but it didn't get the kind of attention it might have in a calmer year. Another thing was the massive earthquake in Gujarat, India in January 2001. It killed more than 20,000 people and caused widespread devastation. Normally, a disaster of that magnitude would have gotten a ton of media attention and international aid, but the focus shifted after September. The Microsoft antitrust case had a significant moment in 2001. The company was fighting to avoid being broken up, but by the government after being found guilty of monopolistic practices. This case was huge for the tech industry, and if 9/11s hadn't happened, it would have been a bigger headline, but it quickly faded from view in the wake of the attacks. In sports, 2001 was also the year that Barry Bonds broke the single-season home run record in Major League Baseball. It was an incredible athletic achievement, but with everything going on after 9/11s, it didn't get nearly the attention it might have otherwise. In 2001, we also had the G8 summit in Genoa, Italy, where major protests against globalization took place. One protester was actually killed during the clash with police, which was a huge deal at the time. It highlighted a lot of the global discontent around issues of inequality in trade, but it was quickly overshadowed by the events of September. Let's not forget about the Madrid peace talks in the Middle East. These were major efforts to bring peace between Israel and Palestine. And while there were always issues with progress, the events of 9/11s basically shifted US and international focus entirely to fighting terrorism. Any momentum that might have existed was pretty much lost. There was also the space shuttle Columbia launching its final successful mission in 2001. It was before the tragic loss of the shuttle 2 years later, but it's still a notable part of NASA's history that didn't get much attention in the chaos of the year. Another overlooked story is the CAL 007 incident resolution. In 2001, the US and Russia finally resolved issues over the Korean Airlines flight that was shot down by the Soviet Union in 1983. It's a historic moment in Cold War diplomacy, but it barely made a blip in the news that year. 2001 was the year that Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber, was executed. Normally, that would have been a major event that dominated news cycles for weeks, but it was completely overshadowed by the larger events of the year. The collapse of the Taliban's rule in Afghanistan, while partly a result of 9/11s, was also one of the most significant geopolitical shifts of 2001. The world had been watching Afghanistan even before the attacks, but the US invasion pushed everything into a different realm of urgency. It's also worth noting that 2001 saw the foot-and-mouth disease outbreak in the UK. This devastated the farming industry and led to the slaughter of millions of animals. It was a huge crisis for the UK, but again, global attention was elsewhere. In the gaming world, Grand Theft Auto I was released in 2001. It revolutionized open-world gaming and is still considered one of the most influential games ever made. But with everything else going on, its release didn't get the kind of mainstream recognition it might have in a different year. And then there was the Voyager I spacecraft leaving the solar system. In 2001, it officially passed the termination shock, a major milestone in space exploration. It was the farthest any man-made object had ever traveled, but it got lost in the shuffle of global events. In the same year, you had the Ireland peace process still ongoing. The Good Friday Agreement had been signed in 1998, but 2001 saw some critical steps toward resolving the Northern Ireland conflict, though it was largely overshadowed by the focus on terrorism and security. A huge moment in 2001 that few people talk about is the Kyoto Protocol coming into effect. It was the first major international agreement to combat climate change. Normally, something like this would have gotten extensive global coverage, but the post-9/11 world had other priorities. The US Postal Service announced a major financial crisis in 2001 as well. It was a sign of the growing strain on traditional mail services, which would eventually lead to years of cuts and debates about its bout. That should have been a big story, but it didn't get much attention. Don't forget about the collapse of Napster in 2001. It had completely changed the way people shared and consumed music, but the legal battles it faced eventually led to its downfall. If not for 9/11s, this might have been one of the biggest tech stories of the year. Another major event was the execution of Slobodan Milosevic. This was huge for the Balkans after years of war crimes and ethnic cleansing during the Yugoslav wars. The fact that this wasn't front-page news everywhere shows just how overwhelming the other events of 2001 were. In the world of tech, Windows XP was launched in 2001. It became one of the most widely used operating systems for years, but it got little attention because it was launched in October, right when the world was still reeling from the attacks. One more overlooked event is the completion of the Öresund Bridge between Sweden and Denmark. It was a massive engineering project that connected two countries and had a huge impact on trade and travel in the region. Normally, this kind of thing would have been a much bigger deal globally. 2001 also saw the reopening of the Leaning Tower of Pisa after years of stabilization work. It's one of the most famous landmarks in the world, but it barely made headlines because of everything else that was happening at the time. In international politics, Vladimir Putin officially became president of Russia in 2001. This marked the start of a long, complicated relationship between Russia and the rest of the world, but it was drowned out by the events of September 11th and the war on terror that followed. On a lighter note, the first Shrek movie came out in 2001. It became a cultural phenomenon and even won the first ever Academy Award for Best Animated Feature. It's crazy to think that this happened the same year as such dark and tragic events. In 2001, the European Union announced plans for the introduction of the euro, as a physical currency in 2002. This was a huge step for Europe, creating a single currency for many of its nations, but the news didn't get the attention it might have in a different year. Another major event in 2001 was the sinking of the Russian submarine Kursk, which had actually happened the year before, but was still being investigated in 2001. The loss of 118 sailors was a massive tragedy, but it was largely forgotten after 9/11s. Finally, the US pulled out of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 2001. This was a major decision in terms of global arms control, signaling a shift in US defense strategy, but it was overshadowed by the ongoing war on terror and fears of further attacks.